Hello everyone. You're tuned in to the first part of a two-part web-based training on cost-benefit analysis for justice policy. My name is Laura Kerslich. I'm a policy analyst at the Vera Institute of Justice. Vera is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, and we are celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. Our mission is to make justice systems fairer and more effective through research and innovation. I am pleased to moderate this two-part training with Mike Wilson of the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission. Mike will have an opportunity to introduce himself a bit later, but for now I'll tell you that Mike is an economist for the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission and director of the State Statistical Analysis Center. He has created a cost-benefit model for Oregon's criminal justice system and has presented this model nationally to criminal justice professionals. In 2007, he received the Philip Hoke Award for Excellence in Analysis for his cost-benefit study of Oregon's prisons. We're delighted to have Mike here today and for the next training in this series on January 25th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're also delighted to have you here. Thanks for joining us. We have participants from roughly 23 states and the Northern Mariana Islands on this call today, so we're hoping for an interesting discussion. We've got a lot to accomplish and not much time to do it, so we'll get to the agenda. Today's agenda includes an introduction and housekeeping items, which you're hearing now, and we'll move into Mike's presentation on CBA and justice policy. Mike will review prison economics, the costs of crime, and estimating effects. We have designated 10 minutes at the end of the training for question and answer, and Mike will occasionally stop and ask for questions. Okay, let's move to the housekeeping items. There are two ways to ask questions during this webinar. You can use the chat feature at the bottom left side of your screen to send us questions at any time. Our Vera staff will be manning the chat feature to get you timely answers to your questions. You can use the raise hand feature at the top left side of your screen to ask a question directly to Mike during the webinar. If you do raise your hand, please check the chat feature for instructions about how to unmute your phone line. We'll only take raised hand questions during designated question and answer periods, so please be patient. For webinar support and troubleshooting, please see the information on your screen. You're all logged in, so that's already a good sign. In your registration materials, you should have received a handout for this webinar. If you do not already have this handout available, please take a moment to download it from your registration or reminder emails. And lastly, you should know that this webinar is recorded and will be posted online. You will receive an email after this webinar with the recording, slides, and any other information that may be helpful to you. To give folks a little more time to settle in, we have this poll that asks you about your familiarity with cost-benefit analysis. So if you could please respond to the poll. It looks like we have about 39 people on the line, and that's great, and we have responses coming in rather quickly. So I'll go ahead and give you a couple more minutes to answer that question. Looks like we're almost there with full participation. That's great. I'm going to go ahead and skip to the results. And we have a fairly mixed audience, I guess. There are folks that are somewhat familiar. Most folks are somewhat familiar. There are some that are extremely familiar, and some that are not at all familiar. Well, whether you're a beginner with cost-benefit or an experienced CBA analyst, you'll be interested to know that this webinar is part of a whole body of work associated with the Cost-Benefit Knowledge Bank for Criminal Justice, or CBKB. CBKB is a project of the Vera Institute funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance. We have just launched a new website, cbkb.org, that helps policymakers get more accessible information about cost-benefit analysis and justice policy. We encourage you to visit the site and send along any feedback that you may have. My contact information will be posted at the end of the presentation, so you can go ahead and email me that way. Okay, we're going to do one more poll here. Bear with me. We want to know what organization you are from so we can better tailor the training to you. So go ahead and respond to that poll. I'll give a couple minutes. That's great. It looks like we are having a lot of participation here. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Good. So we have an even distribution, it looks like. The research and academia is taking the lead there, but you have folks from sentencing commissions and statistical analysis centers and government budget offices. That's great. So let me give you a sense of what you will learn in this two-part series. The two-part training, it will be very practical, giving you the resources you need to build cost-benefit capacity in your own state. In this training, and the training scheduled for Tuesday of next week, you will learn how to assess your jurisdiction's return on investment from criminal justice expenditures. You will also be able to explain how costs and benefits are calculated and become a more educated consumer of cost-benefit studies. In this specific training, the broader of the two-part series, you will learn how to discuss your jurisdiction's return on investment from incarceration. You'll also learn how to deconstruct costs into their component parts and how to interpret an effect size and apply it in cost-benefit studies. Okay, so that's all for my introduction. Here's the main guy on the line, Mike Wilson. So Mike, you can go ahead.
Okay, good morning all, or I guess afternoon for probably many of you. My name is Mike Wilson. I'm the Statistical Analysis Center Director for the state of Oregon, and my background is in economics. I was hired on a few years ago in Oregon. I really didn't have a criminal justice background, but hired on to try to look at some of the good work they're doing in Washington State and bring some of that to Oregon to create a cost-benefit model for Oregon around the criminal justice system. So I just wanted to briefly just talk about cost-benefit analysis and really what is it. It's one of those kind of buzzwords you're hearing, like evidence-based programs. Kind of everywhere you go you hear about cost-benefit analysis. And really cost-benefit analysis is something all of us do all the time we make any decision. You know, if you're on the line here today, you had some, maybe it was a really quick analysis, but you decided, am I going to spend an hour of my day to listen on this webinar, or am I going to do something else? So really, most decisions that we make have, if it's implicit even, we have some sort of cost-benefit analysis that is done in those decisions. And so the cost-benefit analysis that we want to do around criminal justice is to formalize that a little bit because the actors in the criminal justice system are also making cost-benefit analysis, but often without a lot of information or data, and they're sort of making just kind of a snap decision, a cost-benefit type of decision. But we want to be able to put a little more structure around that to give policymakers an idea of what different investments are available, and to be able to show them really a way to weigh different options so they can get the best results at the least cost. So when we think about cost-benefit analysis, really the strengths, as I see them, are to inform policy, that we can take complex issues. If you think of something like something that reduces recidivism and be able to put that into something simpler, just dollars and cents. So we can say, if we have some sort of program that reduces recidivism, we can speak of that in terms of how much money do we have to invest in that program, and how much expenses do we think we can avoid as a result of that program effectively reducing recidivism. So it really allows policymakers sort of a common measurement that's a simple way of thinking about things, and it helps them to think about an efficient way of using their resources. Now, I have the weaknesses here, and they aren't necessarily weaknesses of cost-benefit methodology. They're weaknesses that come up when you do cost-benefit analysis in terms of, one, accuracy. You think of cost-benefit analysis really started with doing road construction and trying to get an idea of if a certain investment should be made, if it was cost-beneficial. Now, what makes these estimates difficult is we often don't know how long a project will take. We don't know some of the costs that are going to be incurred along the way. So many of these road projects would come in considerably over budget, and the initial analysis might have said they were cost-beneficial, but after construction costs and the time it took and unforeseen costs that came up, they often weren't cost-beneficial. And so one of the weaknesses is accuracy, being able to accurately identify what the costs are and the benefits. And you'll see as we go through this, that's not always an easy task. A second weakness is really deciding what costs and benefits to include. Again, this isn't exactly a weakness, but it's something that makes cost-benefit analysis a little bit difficult. An example of that is you think about the Ford Pinto case of the late 70s, and really trying to decide what types of costs and what benefits to include. I think most of you are probably familiar with that the Fords, upon sort of low speed collisions, the gas tank was in the back and would catch on fire as the bolts kind of came up through the gas tank and would spark a fire. And Ford knew about this problem pretty early on, and they did a cost-benefit analysis of this, and they estimated that there would be roughly 1,800 deaths and 1,800 burn victims as a result of this design. Now, they had to figure out how much do you value these things at, and sort of the standard of the day was about $200,000 for a life and about $67,000 for each burn victim. So they went through and they calculated out what would the cost be as a result of injury and death for this design that they had. They came up with the cost would be about $50 million. Now, they looked at that and they said, okay, well, what would it cost to fix this problem? And they had done some research and said it would cost about $11 to fix the problem. And when they multiplied that out over the number of cars they had, the total came out to about $137 million. So you ended up having the cost to fix it were much greater than the benefit, if you want to put it that way, of avoiding the injury cost. Now, what they didn't take into account was that through this, their reputation was badly damaged in the future. Their car sales fell dramatically, and really had much larger costs than they had originally put into this model. So when we look at these sort of cost-benefit analyses, we really have to think about what sort of costs and what sort of benefits are we going to put in there. So when we think about the application of this cost-benefit analysis to the criminal justice system, really in Oregon, we've used this with the ballot initiatives, and I know not all states have this issue, but in Oregon, a lot of our criminal justice policy is done, at least as far as sentencing policy, is done at the ballot box. So we've added prison beds through mandatory minimums, through property offenders getting to prison more quickly. We just passed mandatory minimums on driving under the influence. And so cost-benefit analysis works well with these type of ballot initiatives. But really, the ideal, I think, application of this within the criminal justice system is looking at programs that are designed to reduce recidivism. So if we were to look at a program that, like a drug court, for example, that's designed to reduce drug use. And so we really need to, again, think through sort of how are we going to frame this cost-benefit analysis? What benefits do we want to include in this? Do we want to include victimization costs? Should we include foster care? Are we only going to include costs within the criminal justice system? Do we try to get some measure of general safety? If crime goes down, people buy fewer locks for their doors, maybe fewer alarm systems. There's all these different costs that you could think about putting in, but we need to think through which of these can we measure, first of all, and which of these do we think is relevant for the study we're looking at. And then a second question is, at what level do we want to look at these costs? If you're a state budget person, are you interested in the county costs? Are you interested in victimization costs, or are you only interested in the cost to the state? So there's all these different decision points along the way that when we think of a cost-benefit analysis, we need to think through really what costs do we want to include and what level of measurement, if we're looking at county, state, local, or do we want to include all the costs that we can come up with. So in Oregon, the first application we looked at this, we kind of took the lead of some of the work they've done at Washington State, and we looked at what we call prison economics, and really wanted to look at what was the impact really of our biggest investment was in prisons, and I think that's the case in most states, at least in terms of state dollars. We spend the majority of our criminal justice monies on prisons, and so we wanted to look and say, okay, well, what type of return do we get on this investment? Are we seeing a reduction in the crime rate as a result of increasing our use of our prison resource? And so we did some research, similar research that's been done by Spellman in Texas. Levitt did a similar study. Washington State looked at this, and there's some other areas that have looked at this as well. And we looked and we said, what is the impact on the crime rate of our continued increase in the incarceration rate in Oregon? We found that for about every 10% increase in the incarceration rate, we had around a 2.6% reduction in the crime rate. And so when we think about presenting this information to policymakers, we need to think, well, how is this meaningful to them? If you were to tell a policymaker that a 10% increase in the incarceration rate led to a 2.6% reduction in the crime rate, that probably isn't really meaningful to them. So we wanted to have this cost-benefit analysis as a way to speak to that. So to be able to say how many crimes are actually avoided by incarceration. If we incarcerate one additional offender, what can we say about the number of crimes that we expect to avoid as a result of that. And then the last step of that is adding the cost benefit to that and saying, okay, if we avoid these crimes, how much dollars do we expect to avoid in terms of taxpayer costs and victimization costs? So we did that in Oregon, and we can see that we've had what's called diminishing marginal returns to incarceration. So as we've invested more and more in incarceration, the benefit of that in terms of avoiding crime has gone down. And we can see in the early 90s, when we invested in incarceration, for each additional offender that we incarcerated, we avoided, I think that's about 27, I can't remember the exact number, but between 25 and 30 crimes. Now, as time has gone on, we've incarcerated more offenders in Oregon, and our crime rate has since dropped. We see diminishing returns there that we now avoid. I can't remember if it's 8 or 9. It looks like about 9 from that graph. Around 9 crimes are avoided, and when we last updated this in 2007 for each offender that we incarcerate. Now, this next slide here it takes some older data from Washington State. I'm sure they've updated it since then, since the information I have here. And we also look at this estimate for Oregon. So we then assign dollar values by creating this cost-benefit model. We'll get into the details of how we did this a little bit more today and quite a bit more in the next webinar next week. But you can see that we've had diminishing returns from incarceration. And in the 90s, it was fairly cost-beneficial to invest in incarceration in Oregon. And as time has gone on, that has continued to decline. And this is really the case with any business model as well. When you add a new business to a town, typically you'll get people might drive. They really want to go to that shop. Starbucks is a easy example. If you put one Starbucks in your town, they might attract people from all over the area to come to that one store. Now, as 2, 3, 4, 5 different Starbucks pop up, their revenues are going to diminish as they build more and more of them. And at some point, they'll decide it's not worth building anymore. So we're trying to look at incarceration that same way as a business would, to say, at some point, as the returns diminish, it might not be cost beneficial to continue at the same rate we're going. Now, if we look at Washington, they had a richer data set than we had in Oregon. They were able to break this down by different crime types, and you can see they had diminishing returns as well. But their violent offenders, it was still cost beneficial, at least as of 2005, to incarcerate those offenders, while the property offenders were continuing to decrease and were around about break even, and the drug offenders were never really cost beneficial to incarcerate in the state of Washington. So when you think about building a cost-benefit model, really the starting point of any of this is figuring out the cost of crime. So how much does it cost to the state? How much does it cost to victims? Any different ways we can measure the cost, we want to be able to include those in a cost-benefit model. So when we looked at this in Oregon, we tried to, again, we modeled some of the work they've done at Washington, and we tried to break this down by different crime types. And so we could see what were the costs by crime types of different resource uses. So if we look, we're able to get some of this at the level of crime. So we can look at homicide, sex crimes, robbery, assaults, property, drug, some other crimes, and misdemeanors if that data is available. And in some cases in Oregon it is, and some places we weren't able to track that. But we're able to look at the costs for these different parts of the criminal justice system across crime types. So we could look at the arrest, conviction, and upon conviction, sort of what resources they use there, and get the estimates of these costs. And finally, on the bottom, we have taxpayer and victim costs. So we're also able to look at using, and we'll get into this, a couple national studies to get an estimate of what the costs were to crime victims as well. So you see, we break these down to the extent we can by different crime types. And the reason for this is that if we look at a crime like murder, it's not going to cost the same as a misdemeanor. And you think of the court costs for a murder are much larger than they are for a misdemeanor crime. Now, this is important depending on the type of program you're trying to evaluate. So if you're looking at a program that maybe serves sex offenders, and if that program's effective at reducing crime, you would expect to avoid more sex crimes than if you're looking at a program like drug court, where you expect to avoid more drug crimes. So to the extent that we can break down some of these costs by crime type, we're able to get a little bit more detail on our analysis. Now, if that data isn't available in your area, or you don't have reliable estimates, then there isn't a ton lost on some of these by having the same costs all the way across crime type. But to the extent we can, we want to break these down to show that there are differences in crime type and the costs associated with those. So when we look at the cost by resources, we're looking at the arrest, conviction, and adult costs. You can also do this for the juvenile side. I haven't included that. I haven't done as much work of that in Oregon, but we certainly can create the same type of model for the juvenile side. When we look at costs, we want to ask ourselves, how do we want to think about costs? We want to look at a marginal cost or an average cost. And the difference is, the marginal cost, we're really wanting to look at the cost of an additional unit. So the cost of additional arrest, or an additional conviction, or an additional prison bed. We want to look at the marginal cost, not an average cost, which would have capital costs, overhead costs, and various other costs included in there. So there's a few different ways that you can get at these marginal costs. And one, depending if what level of data is available in your area, you can do what's called a cross-sectional regression analysis, where you can really look at the county level data on budget data for the cost of an arrest and the number of arrests in an area. And you can begin to get estimates on what are the costs of different types of arrests. And we can do the same sort of analysis with conviction data as well, where we can look at court data, district attorneys' budgets, public defender budgets, and look at the number of convictions across different crime types, and get an estimate for the costs. Now in Oregon, that proved to be difficult, and it might be the case in some of your jurisdictions as well. We have, I don't know the exact number, around 170 police departments, and to go and get budget data from each of those would be a difficult task, and then trying to compare different line items in their budget to figure out which ones are comparable would prove to be difficult. So in Oregon, we have the luxury. Washington actually has this data is reported to a central site, and they were able to do this analysis without having to go out and interview all the counties. And we're able to use their estimates here, because Oregon and Washington, our crime rates, our prison rates are all very similar. So it was a pretty easy thing to do. But we've also looked at this some other ways in Oregon, where we've looked at a few of the larger police jurisdictions and gone in and talked to some of their budget folks and tried to get at this idea of a marginal cost. We can do that as well with the courts. We can look at some of the larger counties and go through their budget. So there are some ways of getting around it if you don't have all the budget data reported to a central area. Now the state costs were a little bit easier, and they probably are going to be the case in most states. We've done a lot of work around the marginal costs of a conviction recently in Oregon, as we've looked at some early release programs and looked at not sending certain offenders to prison. Really, the budget office has worked closely with the Department of Corrections to try to get an accurate estimate of what does a marginal cost look like. If we avoid sending 100 people to prison, or we let 100 people out of prison early, how much can we take out of the Department of Corrections budget to give back to the general fund? So those estimates, probably true in most cases, are going to be easier to come by. So when we start to look at the taxpayer costs, we can look at these by, and again, I didn't spend a lot of time with the juvenile portion and what I'm doing here today, but we can look at the police costs, the court costs, and numerous other juvenile costs, and the adult side as well. So it's important to keep track of kind of which tax stream these come out of, because some of these are going to be state costs, while others are going to be local costs. Like police and courts are going to be a mixture of state but largely local costs, where the the adult prison probation in Oregon is all going to be state costs. I think that's the case in most states. And the jail costs are sort of a mixture of state and county costs in Oregon. So the last piece of this are the victimization costs. And really, this is going to be difficult for any state to get this level of detail without doing an extensive study. So most people, when we're looking at victimization costs, take a couple of national studies here that look at these. And 1996 was the last. The National Institute of Justice did a study that had been used for years, and it's just been updated in 2010 using a similar methodology with newer data, newer estimates. So it gives a quick idea of how we get at the costs for the criminal justice system and how we get the victimization costs. Now keep in mind, the next webinar next week, we're going to go into some of this in a little more detail. This is really meant to be kind of a higher level overview of some of these issues to give you an idea of how this is set up, and then in the next part we'll get into more detail. So depending on how we're doing on time here, I'm not sure, Laura, is there time for questions?
There's time for probably 2 questions, and we've actually had a question come in from Sonia Lars. So if Sonia is there, you can go ahead and unmute your line. Sonia, are you there? Hello? Yeah, well, we actually have her question, so I'll just go ahead and ask it to you, Mike. Does Oregon have one cost collection agency that collects all this information on costs?
No, we do not. And that's what makes some of this difficult. Is for the local costs, we don't have any agency that collects the local budget data, and I'm guessing that's going to be the case for many states. I know Washington, they do collect all of these budgets at the state level, the local budgets. In Oregon, we don't, and so that makes it difficult to get some of the the arrest costs and the cost of conviction. Now, the other costs are a little bit easier to come by, like probation, parole, post-prison supervision, Department of Corrections, those sort of things they're done with the Legislative Fiscal Office and with the Department of Corrections. But the local costs are not collected statewide, which causes a problem, and it might make sense for some other states out there to look at some of the larger agencies in their state to try to estimate these and kind of apply that cost to the state.
Thanks, Mike. That's great. I'll just go ahead and take the privilege of asking another question here because I'm the moderator. Could you tell me how legislators have reacted to victimization costs in the past and whether they've been receptive?
Sure. And this is it's kind of a hard question to answer. I don't know exactly what their thoughts are on it, but typically I've always separated out the victimization costs from the taxpayer costs. And I do this because I think it really is important to include the victimization cost in there, because I don't think it's fair to decide criminal justice policy without including the impact it has on victims. So I think that's an important component. However, policymakers, and particularly when we're talking to budget folks, they aren't going to see any savings to the general fund as a result of the victimization costs that are estimated here. So I think there's certain legislators that really think it's important to show those and take it into account, probably give it quite a bit of weight, where others are more concerned with the budget and probably give less weight to it. But again, I think it's important to be able to, I guess first to be able to show that there are victimization costs, and often the victimization costs are as high or as larger than the taxpayer costs. So it's important to be able to show those, but it's also important to be able to differentiate between the two, so that legislators and policymakers can see that what the components are of the benefit estimate that you're giving them.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Mike. That's all the questions we'll take for now, but I just want to put out a reminder that if you do have a question, you can type it into the chat feature at the bottom left side of your screen, or you can raise your hand, and feel free to raise your hand early, and we'll send you instructions for how to unmute your phone line. But Mike, feel free to go ahead.
Okay, so going on, continuing on with the cost of crime. So really we've looked at, just summarize sort of where we can get some of the costs of crime and what some of those costs might be, and included the table 1 that was in your packet for Oregon. So that gives you the first step. You need to know how much these different things cost, but that doesn't really tell you how much a murder, for example, we had the cost of the Department of Corrections in there was at $13,000, I can't remember, 800 something. But that doesn't tell you how much a convicted murderer costs the state of Oregon, because they're going to be in prison for multiple years. So we really want to look at how offenders move through the system, and this is going to be an important part for any state to have their own data on, because how an offender moves through the system in Oregon is going to be much different than how an offender moves through the system in, say, Oklahoma, where a drug offender will be sentenced to prison in Oklahoma, where Oregon rarely does someone who just comes in for possession of drugs go to prison. So those are the types of things that we're going to want to look through. And I've got a probability tree here that just looks at, there really is probabilities of these different events occurring. So an offense happens that may or may not be reported. So we can look at how often are those reported, and that's important for getting back to victimization costs. If we look at, given that the offense is reported, how often is there an arrest on that? If there's an arrest, we want to know how often that arrest ends in a conviction. And once there's a conviction, we can use up different resources of either the Department of Corrections or probation. And once they use up one of those resources, we want to know how long they're there. So we can begin to think of, we know the cost of these, and if we can quantify sort of how an offender moves through the system and how much of each resource they use, we can begin to estimate how much we can save or how much cost can be avoided if we're able to avoid crime. So Table 2, this is in your pack if you printed it out off, I think it was on the invitation. But Table 2 shows sort of how we looked at this in Oregon. And we can see that we've, again, broken this down by crime type, and we looked at the probability of different events. So if there's an offense, how often are those offenses reported? And then we can look at how much crime there actually is, and we can look at the probability, because we know how many offenses there are, and I think this data is going to be available in all states. We know how many offenses there are. We can use national data on percent of crime that's reported, and we can begin to estimate how much actual crime we think there is in our state. And we can look at the probability, given that there's a crime, someone's arrested. If they're arrested, how likely they're to be convicted. And we can look through, kind of going back to that tree diagram, of how much of the resources are used by offenders in your jurisdiction. So when we looked at the probability of a crime being reported, this is national data. We looked at the National Victimization Survey. And we can see that this varies by crime type. We can see property crimes are less likely to be reported than person crimes. And there might be some other adjustments that need to be made for your state, depending on your uniform crime reports, how closely those are related to felony arrest and convictions in your state. So in Oregon, we had to make some adjustments to thefts. Many of our crimes that come up as a UCR Part 1 crime, thefts are often misdemeanors, and so we wanted to match this up to our felonies. Again, the rape category and UCR code is very specific. We have many other felony sex crimes that wouldn't be captured in that, so we need to make some adjustments to account for that. And that might be the case in your jurisdiction as well. So looking at how these probabilities work, this is taking some of the information from Table 2, and you can see that for the rape, other sex category, we had a little over 4,200 reported crimes. Under 1,000 of those ended in arrest. So we can see our arrest rate. So given that the crime was reported, about a quarter of those offenses ended in arrest. And we can see that those rates vary quite a bit by crime type. You can see with motor vehicle down only around 1 in 10 of the reported motor vehicle thefts actually ended in arrest. So we can go on to the next step of that. Again, the same sort of probability idea of, so what's the likelihood of an offense leading to an arrest? So now we're looking at all of the offenses, not just the reported offenses. So we can look at the number reported. We can divide that by the report rate to get an idea of the number of actual offenses. And we can see what the probability of an arrest is, given that when we take the actual number of offenses that we think occurred. So again, these are important. Going back to the total number of offenses that we think occurred, these are important if we want to get an estimate at the number of victimizations and include victimization costs in the study. If we were to leave that out, we wouldn't need to know how many actual offenses there are, because if an offense isn't reported to the police, there isn't going to be any cost to that offense in the criminal justice system, but there will be cost to victims. So to the extent that we want to be able to capture the cost of victims, we need to have an estimate of what the report rate is and how many offenses we actually think there are in our area. So again, this is something that might prove a little bit challenging. Again, it's sometimes difficult depending on how your data is collected. The UCR data doesn't always match up with the revised statutes in your state. So in Oregon, again, we had the UCR data for some of these which were misdemeanors. We had additional felonies that weren't captured in the UCR data. So we needed to sort of create a crosswalk where we could say these types of crimes are misdemeanors the majority of the time, and we can get an estimate of that. And so we talked to 3 of our larger police jurisdictions to get an estimate of these. Again, it wasn't a huge amount of work, but it's something that might not be readily available in the data, so it might require some conversations with some of the local folks on how certain arrests are coded in the uniform crime reports compared to your revised statutes. So Laura, that section went pretty quickly. Do we want to do a question here, or should I continue on?
Sure, let's do a question here. We have Amalia Thompson on the line. If Amalia could go ahead and unmute her phone line and ask the question. Amalia, are you there? Okay, we may have some technical difficulties with unmuting phone lines, but we do have another question from Jennifer Acton. And she wanted to know, Mike, is the underlying assumption that the programs that are being evaluated are fully funded, and does that affect the cost-benefit results?
Okay, and that would get into when we get a little further along to the effect sizes, but so the effect sizes, and I might be jumping ahead here a little bit, but there's a couple of different ways we can look at the effect sizes, and so we'll have either an effect size that we've done in our own state or an effect size that we get from the literature. And so if we aren't fully funding our program in our state and we've evaluated it and come up with an effect size, then yes, the program wouldn't need to be fully funded because we would have the effect size that goes with that program that's not fully funded. If we're looking at literature review that says a program has a 10% expectation of reducing recidivism, and we are not implementing that program the same way as the literature, or we're not fully funding it, then we would want to try to adjust for that in the analysis. But that ties in a little bit more to the effect size stuff that we'll get to near the end.
Okay, great. Why don't you go ahead, Mike?
Okay.
We're a little short on time.
Yeah. So continuing on with the cost of crime, we've sort of the quick review. We've covered what the costs are to the different parts of the criminal justice system and to victims, and we've looked at the probabilities of how offenders move through the system. So as we look at offenders moving through the system, we need to look at the last part of that, of once they're convicted, how much of really the most expensive resource, the Department of Corrections, prison beds, how much of that resource do they use? And so we want to look at really what percent of convicted offenders get prison, what percent get probation, and how many get local control, which in Oregon, that's what would be a prison sentence of less than a year, and they're handled in the local jails, but the state pays for it. So we want to look at how many go to each part of the criminal justice system, and what are the average lengths of stay. I have sentences there, but really it's what are the average lengths of stay. So not how long are they sentenced, but how long do they stay in prison, probation, or local control. So we get an idea of how much of each of these resources are used, and then we want to take that and look at the present value of that. So really taking future dollars and using the discount rate to bring those back into current dollars, so we get an idea of how much dollars do we avoid by avoiding one of these types of crimes. So table 3, again, this is in your printout. This looks at, in Oregon, kind of what the sentencing distribution is. So we can look at what's the probability that a homicide, for example, ends in a prison sentence. And so we can see that in Oregon, most of them, 92%. This is going to include some manslaughter and vehicular homicide, so that's why that's not 100%. But we see that majority of those end in prison, and those that go to prison have a sentence length of 257 months, so just over 20 years. So the majority of homicides go to prison for a very long time. So you can see as we look through the sentence distribution that although a year in prison costs the same for each of these crime types, a conviction for one of these crime types is going to use a lot more of that resource. So a homicide will use prison almost every time for a very long period of time, where a drug crime, only 10% go to prison, and when they do go to prison, it's under 2 years. So you see, this is really a very important part to look at in your state. And this is going to, I think there's going to be large variations across states. So there's certain parts of, I guess, this cost-benefit analysis that you're probably okay using some outside data outside your state, on victimization costs, maybe even on some of the other portions on the taxpayer costs if you have a state that's similar to you. But when you're looking at sentencing, which is important in building this cost-benefit model, this is going to vary a lot by state. And so it will be important to come up with your own data here to really look at how long are people in prison and how likely are they to use that resource. As this varies across states, you can get much different results if you don't have good data for this in your own state. So again, do we have time for another question?
Okay, yes, Mike, we have Amalia Thompson. I think she's ready to ask her question.
Okay.
Hopefully. So Amalia, are you there?
Yes, hello.
Okay.
Okay.
Why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Great. Considering the perspective that correctional facilities are seen as an economic development tool, are there any categories of data that are used on both sides of the equation? Like, for instance, the cost of employing individuals who work at correctional facilities. Are those only seen as costs, or are they at all seen as benefits as well?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So in the modeling we've done, those have only been seen as a cost to in this case, the state general fund. If we employ correctional officers, then those have been seen strictly as costs, not as benefits to rural areas that if the prison if the prison isn't staffed anymore, that those are going to be people that are out of jobs. Typically, the one reason that is a concern, but the one reason that we haven't looked at that very closely is typically when we release people from prisons, those prisons haven't been closed down. Maybe in some states, but for the most part, we just closed a minimum facility prison in Oregon, but many of those people there are some that lose their jobs, but there's many of those that are continue to be employed within the Department of Corrections, and there might be fewer hirings in the future. But yeah, so anyway, I guess that's a good question as I think it through. We haven't included it as a on both sides of the equation. We've only included it as a cost.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Mike, you can go ahead and move on to your next section. I have one reminder for folks that are asking questions. If you're in full screen mode viewing the webinar, you may have to exit full screen to be able to see the chat feature and get instructions about how to unmute your phone line. So just keep that in mind. We will have a question and answer section at the end, so we can ask the remaining questions then. But Mike, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. Sounds good. So the last section, looking through here, are how do we go about estimating effects? And really, so we built this cost-benefit model. Obviously, this is a very high-level overview, but we put together this cost-benefit model that looks at sort of how offenders move through the system, the cost of each part of the criminal justice system, and we can begin to say, okay, if we can avoid crime, then we can quantify, given some of the assumptions we've made, we can quantify the impact that avoiding crime would have. Now, really, the part that we need to make this tool useful for policymakers is we need to have estimates on how effective programs or policies are at reducing crime. Because if we build a model that talks about the benefits, the monetary benefits of reducing crime, but we don't have any idea of if our programs reduce crime or how much crime they reduce, then that tool doesn't have as much application as it otherwise would. So here we're looking at what is an effect size, and really it's just, probably most of you are familiar with this, it really is just quantifying the effectiveness of a particular program or a policy. So if we look at, we administer drug court grants in our agency in Oregon. So if we were to look at drug courts and we want to figure out how effective they are at reducing crime, that is really the effect size. So if we do a study that shows that they're blank % effective at reducing crime, that's really our effect size. And then we're able to, using the first 3/4 of this presentation today, we're able to look and say, okay, now we know the dollars associated with avoiding that amount of crime. So where do we get effect sizes? And there are really a couple of different ways of doing it. One is if we were able to evaluate programs in our own state, we can take those estimates for a given program. And in Oregon, we've done some of this. We have some of the programs we've evaluated, but certainly when you think of all the programs that a state has, all the money that goes out to administer these programs, there really isn't enough resources to estimate effect sizes for all these different programs. So to the extent that you can, if you have an evaluation in your own state, then great, you can use that effect size to create a cost-benefit analysis of that program. And there's also what many people use is a meta-analysis, and the Washington State Institute of Public Policy has done a wonderful job of done a lot of the homework here, where they've looked through hundreds of studies and estimated and sort of categorized these different programs and estimated based on the literature that's out there what types of programs work and what are the effect sizes on those programs. Finally, if there is no effect size available, if you're maybe starting up a new program or something that hasn't been researched very well, you can also calculate sort of cost effectiveness or what would really be the break-even point to pay for a program. So you could look at a program and say, this program costs $2,000 to administer per participant. If we're able to have an effect size of 5%, we can reduce crime by 5%. This program will be cost beneficial. So that's another way of looking at it. If there's no effect size available, you can use the existing data that you have in the cost benefit tool that you've created, and sort of back into what effect size would you need in order to be able to see if a program is cost beneficial. So the advantages, I think I've kind of gone over these a little bit already, but if you look at the effect sizes from the literature, it might not match your state. So if you're looking at something from a state, if I'm looking for something at inner city New York compared to rural Oregon, is an effect size, is it really applicable if it's a different ethnic group, a different demographic, different time period, all the different things that might change from make one study not pertinent to an area in your own state. Another thing is effectiveness changes over time. In Oregon, we've had a program here we evaluated a few years back. The program looked great. They had some staff turnover. They evaluated it again. They didn't see any effect size. So effectiveness does change over time, and without in-state evaluation, you're not going to see that just by looking at the literature. Advantages of the meta-analysis, though, are that these programs might not exist in your own state, and it is, I've said that really impossible, I guess not impossible, very expensive and difficult, and there aren't resources out there to do evaluations on all the programs. So that's really the advantage of a meta-analysis is a lot of that homework has already been done, so you don't have to recreate it. So to apply an effect size, really the cost-benefit analysis goes, it monetizes what the effect size is. So we can look and say, if we have a 10% effect size, we can estimate how much crime we've avoided, and we've put dollar values to that amount of crime, and we can say how much benefit there is for one participant going through a program. So in order to get the next steps, we need to be able to estimate really what are the program costs to that program. So we're looking, like I said, the example of drug courts. How much do drug courts cost? And once we have that cost, along with an effect size, then we can estimate if drug courts in Oregon are cost beneficial, either from the meta-analysis or from studies that we've done in our own state. And here's just an example of some work that was done in New York using the structure of the Washington State Institute of Public Policy came up with the effect sizes. I just looked at a few different programs, and you can see the review of the literature or the number of studies that have been done. So you look at functional family therapy. There's been 7 studies done that says there's about an 18% effect size. So plugging that in to the model, you can see that there's benefits for all these programs that exceed the cost. So the last real slide here is sort of in summary, kind of the big picture takeaway of all of this is in Oregon we've looked at this and other states have too. Incarceration does have an impact on reducing crime, and we're able to use cost benefit to get an estimate of what the monetary benefits are of incarceration in terms of avoided taxpayer dollars and avoided victimization costs. However, these returns have been diminishing over time. As we've incarcerated more people, as we've kind of cast a wider net and captured less prolific and severe offenders, the returns on incarceration have gone down. So that same cost-benefit tool, though, can be used to also look at programs that are designed to reduce recidivism, and we can begin to look at, break these down by different parts of the criminal justice system to see how beneficial are these programs at saving general fund dollars, saving total taxpayer dollars, and saving victimization costs. So using these effect sizes that are either from the literature or our own state, we can use cost-benefit analysis really to provide policymakers with better tools to make decisions on how to invest the scarce dollars, which I think really is pertinent to all policymakers right now as states struggle with their budgets. So really that's what I have for this part of the webinar. We'll get into a lot more detail in the next one, but do we have additional questions, or do we have time for additional questions? I guess I should ask first.
Yeah, sure, Mike. You have about 5 minutes for questions. So why don't we go to a question from Melvin Faisal. Melvin, if you're there, go ahead and unmute your phone line, and you can ask the question directly to Mike. Melvin? Hello? Okay. Well, why don't we go with the question? We have another one from Sarah Mark, and if she can't unmute her phone line, then we have other questions coming into the chat.
Okay.
So go ahead, Sarah. Do you have your question? She would like to know, okay, so Mike, we just have her question in the chat, and she wants to know what's the difference between cost-effectiveness analysis and cost-benefit analysis.
Okay. The way I would think of it is a cost-effectiveness analysis is you can look at a program without an effect size, and there might be different terminology that different people use, but I would think of it, you can look at the program and say, is this program what will we need to get it to be cost-effective, meaning that we have sort of a break-even point. So we could, without an effect size, we could look at a program and say, if we have given it costs $2,000 for a participant, we can have, if we have a 5% effect size, we will break even, and the program will be cost-effective. With a cost-benefit, I think more of you would have the effect size, and you would have the dollars. You have all those parts, and you can look and say, if we invest $2,000 for a participant in this program, we would expect to avoid $5,000 in terms of victimization costs and taxpayer costs.
Thanks, Mike. We also have a question, or a couple questions coming in about how you've built capacity in Oregon to do cost-benefit. So what are some of the first steps that an economist in some other state might take to build that capacity?
Sure, and really a lot of this was my boss, my director, hired me. My first 6 months on the job, really no one knew I worked here, so I was sort of under the radar. And my job was to put together a cost-benefit model, and I spent a lot of time reading the work they've done in Washington. I made a couple trips up there, worked closely with them, and then just was really involved with the other agencies in the state, figuring out their budget data, how offenders move through the system. Really, you need to not just stay. I mean, government typically state government has a lot of silos. You need to begin to break down those silos, get data from different agencies to figure out how a person moves through the system. So it was really, it hasn't been a staff thing. I'm really the only one who's worked to build this in Oregon. But it was originally my boss kind of protecting my time to work on it, and then using Washington State. It has a lot of resources. You can read up on a lot of work they've done. And we're being, just 2.5 hour drive up to Olympia. I was able to make a couple of drives up there to talk with them as well. But that was really what we did, was looked at their work and began trying to work with other agencies in the state to understand how people move through the system and not just keep the silos of data that we normally have.
Thanks, Mike. There's just one. We'll take one last question that came through the chat on how you actually get cost data for arrests.
Okay.
So if you could expand a little bit on that, and then obviously we'll get into that in more detail in the next webinar also.
Sure. And for me, the simple answer is I kind of cheated. I took it from Washington because they already had done a good, reliable estimate, and we have similar policing patterns, and our wages aren't that different, and so we have a lot of similarities to Washington. So that's what we did, is we were able to take what they'd done in Washington. But an alternative way that we consider doing would be to interview some of the larger agencies in Oregon. So to go to the Portland Police Bureau or the Salem Police Department and begin to work with some of their budget folks on how much they spend on various activities. And if you have some of that over time and you have enough agencies, you can estimate what the marginal cost of an arrest is in those agencies. If you only have one good agency that you can deal with, you can begin to work with their budget people as well, take out some of the capital costs, the overhead costs, and estimate sort of a kind of a quasi-marginal average cost. And really, you don't have, for an arrest cost, I don't think it's necessary to be able to break it down by each different crime type. So I think you could just have, if the worst case scenario, you can begin to do some of those. There's some alternative ways of estimating it by talking to local police departments, and there's some national budget data out there that you can use as well.
That's great. Thanks so much, Mike. We're going to wrap up, and just as a reminder, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and email me. My contact information will be at the last slide, and you have Mike's contact information right in front of you now, so you can go ahead and email and follow up that way. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. And to review, today we've discussed prison economics, and you've learned a bit more about how to calculate your jurisdiction's return on investment from incarceration. We've also deconstructed costs and effect sizes, and hopefully you've learned more about the component parts of crime costs and how to apply an effect size to a cost-benefit analysis. In Part 2, which is coming up on January 25th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, you will practice what we've learned today. We'll learn how to calculate the cost of a single offense. You'll build a cost-benefit model following Oregon's the drug courts, and you'll use cost-benefit analysis in decision-making. Note that you're already registered for this training, and will receive an email tomorrow with a link and phone number for the training. A couple more items. Please complete the evaluation form as you exit the training. It takes less than a minute and helps us tailor the next training to your interests. If you would like more information about upcoming webinars or events, you can follow us on Twitter or visit us at www.cbkb.org. Lastly, I want to thank again the Bureau of Justice Assistance for their support in the development of CBKB and this webinar. I also want to thank Mike Wilson for his presentation. And there's my contact information. Thank you for being here. We appreciate your contribution to the conversation, and we will see you next week. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.